I like to tell people that I was in prison for 12 years, but actually I was the prison chaplain. I'm not sure there was much of a difference at times. But I learned a lot about our justice system, especially our criminal justice system, and a lot about its imperfections. And even though we say justice is blind, it does see a few things. One of them, it sees the color green, which is money. If you have enough resources, you can probably get out of trouble or at least minimize the trouble you're in. The other thing that it often sees is your educational status. Those who are uneducated and on the poorer side of things often don't have the wherewithal to figure out the complexities of the system, and they're often manhandled by the system. And one thing I also learned was our system of justice works really well if you're guilty. The plea bargain system often means that the guilty are convicted of a much lesser crime even than the one they had committed, and they get off much easier. However, if you're innocent, it can be almost impossible to demonstrate that once you are charged. If you maintain your innocence and refuse a plea bargain, you will be subject to the full sentence without hope of parole, and you will have to serve the full sentence. One of the people I met was a young man many years ago. He was arrested for a crime of first-degree murder, and with the possibility of the sentence of death. And when he came into our prison, something just didn't add up about his case. I began to quickly see that he probably hadn't committed the crime he was charged with. And so he went to trial, and the trial went on. The jury came back with the verdict, and the foreman of the jury stood up and said, "We, the jury, find the defendant not." And then one of the other jurors said, "Your Honor, I think I disagree." And so the judge declared a mistrial. Just one word was left off the delivery of the verdict. Well, of course, if you know anything about prosecution, the second time's a charm because you could figure out all the holes where you went wrong in the first trial. In the second trial, he was convicted and he was sentenced to death. And I stayed in touch with him over the years and tried to tell him that while man's justice is often flawed, God's justice will ultimately vindicate his people and will reveal the truth. But that was a hard sell. And over the years, I remained involved with his case. There were many, many appeals, many setbacks that went back and forth. And finally, after 20 years, the police released the evidence and were able to do DNA testing. And his sentence, his verdict of guilty was thrown out by the courts. And last year in May, he was granted his full freedom after 20 years on death row. And that's kind of the scene in the gospel today. You know, there will come a time when God will vindicate his people. It's just that the time isn't now. And it can be very hard to live with the injustices that we see and how often we are judged by the world. But we do believe that the time will come when the church is teaching on many aspects of life, marriage and the family and such will be vindicated. It's just not now. And so what does that mean for us? Well, I think it means two things. One is we will be mocked, scorned, considered backward, medieval even, maybe even persecuted. Certainly we can lose our good standing in society for refusing to go along with the prevailing way of thinking. And second, it means that we have to be faithful to the struggle or the spiritual battle. And that's where our first reading comes in and is so poignant. Amalek in the first reading. It's almost strange that we should be telling this story so many thousands of years later. After all, it wasn't really a great war, it was just a small intertribal battle. But the church puts it in the liturgy because it sees in it a spiritual metaphor for the struggle that believers must endure until the time God's justice reigns. We often call it spiritual warfare. It's really that, and it must be engaged. And in the scriptures in the Bible, Israel always stands for God's way of doing things. And those who oppose Israel are in effect opposing God. So God tells Moses to prepare for the battle, choose certain strong men who can fight and will not give up. And so Moses goes up to the top of the mountain so he could see and direct the battle. And as long as he holds his hands in prayer, the Israelites are winning. When Moses stops, they begin to lose. So Aaron and Hur hold Moses' hands up, supporting them so he could remain in constant prayer while his men fought. In many ways, that's the image of the church. We call it often the church militant fighting the battle on earth. Moses is the leader, we can say, for ourselves, then the Pope, the bishops, who are directing us in this spiritual battle are leading us. Arming us not with physical weapons, but with teaching, spiritual practices, and ways of thinking through which we can engage the battle. And the church is always at prayer, constantly praying for its members. Some of you are right out there on the front lines. Others are like Aaron and Hur, supporting the church, providing for the church, donating to the church so that it will be constantly at prayer. Because you provide for the church, there's a building where the church can gather and pray. There are priests and deacons, monks, nuns, and monasteries that pray without ceasing. And as long as we do that, we will be on the winning side of the spiritual battle. But that doesn't mean the fighting won't be intense, or that there won't be moments when we feel we're losing or we're just too weak to continue. No, it means that as long as we are at prayer, God's justice will, in the end, be our vindication. So the battle continues. Find your role in this great drama of the universe and take your position. The battle, we know, has been ongoing, and it is far too important to the vindication of God's people to be ignored. Ultimately, there can only be one source of justice, and that is God. And we know the imperfections of justice here on earth. And Jesus tells us in the gospel, when he returns, will he find faith on earth? In other words, will it be that we just take matters into our own hands and do what we want? Or will we trust God and trust that he will grant us the vindication, the victory in the end? Like all those who await justice, we often grow tired, not of the battle, but of the long, weary road that we have to walk. But that's why we have to listen to those comforting words of today's gospel, that God will see to it that justice is finally and fully realized for his people.